Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Pantheon Weekly. This is week number 2, and today we're going to be talking about the prehistory of Terminus. Now, prehistory is what I'm calling it. I believe the official terminology would be called before the ages. I like prehistory better. It's more, I guess I'll call it down to earth. That's what we call the time before writing and history in our planet, so that's what I'm going to call it for Terminus. Now, in order to discuss the history of Terminus, we need to kind of establish some common terms and background information. Let me go ahead and say it now. Pronunciations of fantasy words is nearly impossible, and I could not really find a good source of pronunciations. So bear with me. If I ever hear the correct pronunciation, I will be sure to share that with you. So at the beginning of each video that we cover the history, I may drop in some, we'll call them vocab words, like you're in school. So for today, you need to know the word Ivozel. Okay, that's the original name for the planet that we now call Terminus. More on that later. We've got the idea of collisions, okay? Now, collisions is what we're going to call the sudden arrival of races that previously did not exist on Terminus or Ivozel. Something to note about these quote-unquote collisions is that it is not an evolutionary thing. Okay, we're not talking humans came from apes. It's not a transportation from another planet. Okay, the dwarves did not fly in on spaceships and land on Terminus. It's more of a sudden appearance for no apparent reason. This is the primary point of the lore, where these races just suddenly appear and then they affect the world. They influence society. We'll talk about them a lot. Another term you're going to need to know is the Sacred Six. The Sacred Six refers to the first 6 races that appeared on Terminus as a result of a collision. These first 6 were the dwarves, elves, ogres, archai, darkmere, and humans. Dwarves, elves, ogres all showed up within a couple years of each other, and then there was a gap before the archai, darkmere, and humans appeared. Something to note when we talk about the Sacred Six is as these 6 races were appearing, they were not the only new races to Terminus. Okay, these are just the Sacred Six because these are the races that would influence Terminus the most, both politically, geographically, all of that stuff. And if you haven't caught on yet, those are 6 of the playable races for Pantheon. Another term that you need to know is IH. IH, also known as Ethos Brun Hylan. Just call it IH. I'll never say that word again because it's impossible. But IH is the new calendar that was created to track the years since the apparent disappearance of dragonkind. Think of it similar to how we have BC and AD here on Earth, or BCE and CE, depending on who you ask, where it's before a certain point in our history, and then it starts counting up. Same thing here. IH starts with year 1, and year 1 IH is the first year that the dragons were no longer the reigning power on Terminus. Now, that's pretty much the vocabulary you'll need to know for today's episode, so let's get into it. For generations before the arrival of the dwarves, the world of Ivozel was ruled by dragons. There were 2 factions of dragons, the dragons of air, which were also known as Rai Volreen, and the dragons of the sea, which were called Sol Cromane. Thousands of years before the first collision, Rock Nilthamos led the dragons of air into battle against the sea dragons, and was able to achieve a glorious victory to claim sole dominance over Ivozel. Rock Nilthamos was the son of the dragon king Rock Solfinsire. On the day of this great battle, Rock Solfinsire did not celebrate the victory or proclaim his son to be the heir to the throne. Instead, Rock-Sulfensire mourned his brother, who was the leader of the sea dragons. This apparent slight enraged Rock-Nilthamos, and he viciously attacked his own father, taking the throne for himself and killing Rock-Sulfensire. Thus began the reign of Rock-Nilthamos. Rock-Nilthamos is described as a beast of mythical size and strength. He was not simply another dragon with great strategic ability, he simply overpowered the sea dragons. He also appears to be very loyal to his soldiers and friends. It is suggested that part of his anger toward his father stems from the memory of his dead companions who lost their lives in that great battle. Rock-Nilthamos would reign for thousands of years, relatively unchallenged, until suddenly all of dragonkind would seemingly retreat into the far reaches of the planet and enter into a dead hibernation. It is at this turn of events that Ivozel would be renamed to Terminus, and the new calendar would start with year 1 IH, although the dwarves of Old Dasa would not arrive on Terminus until 7 IH. It is clear that dragons still exist, and there are stories, which we will cover at a later date, of mortals meeting and talking with dragons, though dragonkind seems to want nothing to do with the new races of Terminus. Now that we kind of have the baseline of the story of dragons, we're going to jump into kind of my ideas for what may happen as part of the actual gameplay in Pantheon. It's obvious that the dragons are kind of an integral part of the story that we will experience here, even though the official year of, let's call it, players entering the game world is 987 IH. They seem to put an emphasis on this mystery of the dragons. They have a ton of lore that we will cover later with the Keeper, who found this thing called the Dragon Accord. It gets real deep real quickly. So, because of my experience with EverQuest, I'm assuming that these dragons will be an endgame raid, maybe even a dungeon, but I am predicting a raid. Okay, in EverQuest, there were 2 dragons at launch, and there would be more later, Nagafin and Vox. And those 2 dragons were, I believe, they were the hardest creatures in the game at launch. I think they're going to go a similar route here. It may not be... I'm hoping that it's not Rock-Nilthamos that we fight in a raid at the beginning. I kind of want them to just kind of show us the Dragon King and not let us fight it. Maybe he flies overhead at some point in a raid or in a dungeon. I don't really want to have the chance to fight him. I want him to be so far up in the mountains that it's impossible for players to reach him, at least at this time. I'm hoping that maybe for a later update or an expansion that we then can experience Rock-Nilthamos. I don't want him to be the big boss at the end of the launch content. The lore itself lays it on pretty heavy that there is some other unseen force that may have pushed the dragons into these outskirts of the world and kind of laid the path for the Sacred Six to come into power. Or it's possible that the dragons made a deal with this mystery faction, and that is what triggered the arrival of the Sacred Six. I am very curious to find out what exactly the dragons have to do with the game that we're going to experience at launch. There is a prophecy of a great reward for the dragons as long as they bide their time and wait patiently. Thanks everybody for watching this video. I will be back next week. In the meantime, I want to know what are your predictions for dragons in the actual game? Do you think it'll be raids? Do you think it'll be dungeons? Do you think they might be an ally for us? Based on the Keeper's records, I think we may have some dragon allies, some friendly dragons that we'll have a chance to interact with. So what do you think? Will they be our allies? Will they be the enemy? Let me know in the comment section below, and I will see you all next week.